Imagine a boy from a small Mediterranean island, ignored by the powerful, mocked by classmates, and treated like an outsider, growing up with one dangerous obsession: not wealth, not comfort, not popularity, power. Imagine that boy staring at maps instead of toys, memorizing battlefields instead of poems, dreaming not of a normal life, but of history itself. Now imagine that same boy becoming the man who would shake Europe until kings and emperors could not sleep peacefully. What if I told you that Napoleon Bonaparte did not rise because the world invited him, but because he forced the world to make space for him? What if I told you he was not born into greatness? He built it with fire, speed, and ruthless intelligence. And what if I told you that Napoleon is one of the most misunderstood human beings in history? Because some people remember him as a hero, a genius, a modernizer, a man who changed laws and built new systems. Others remember him as a tyrant, a conqueror, a storm that drowned Europe in blood. But the truth is darker and more fascinating than both. Because Napoleon was not just a soldier, he was an idea. He was propaganda with a heartbeat. He was ambition with a uniform. He was a man who could turn fear into loyalty and defeat into legend. And the scariest part is that he did all of this while still young, while most men were still trying to understand life. At 24, he was already winning battles that older generals could not even imagine. At 26, he was becoming a national obsession. At 30, he was taking control of France. And then he did something that shocked the world. He did not wait for a crown, he created one. He did not wait for permission, he took destiny by the throat. In 1804, with the Pope standing right there, Napoleon grabbed the crown and placed it on his own head. And in that single moment, he sent a message to every ruler on earth. No one gives me power. I take it. But here is the question that makes Napoleon's story truly terrifying. How does a man rise so fast that he becomes unstoppable? How does a single mind turn entire armies into weapons? How does a leader convince thousands to march across continents and die for his dream? Because Napoleon didn't just win battles, he rewrote the rules of war. He moved faster than anyone expected. He struck before his enemies were ready. He used cannons like chess pieces and soldiers like waves. And when Europe tried to stop him, he didn't slow down. He multiplied. He created new strategies, new alliances, new lies, new headlines. Because Napoleon understood something that most rulers never understood. The battlefield is not only made of swords and guns, it is also made of stories. It is made of newspapers. It is made of fear. It is made of the image people believe. And Napoleon mastered that image like a magician. He could lose a battle and still appear victorious. He could retreat and still look unstoppable. He could bleed and still appear immortal. And yet, for all his genius, Napoleon also carried weaknesses that would eventually destroy him. He was brilliant, but he was impatient. He was visionary, but he was addicted to control. He was fearless, but he underestimated nature itself. Because the most powerful enemy Napoleon ever faced was not an army. It was winter. It was distance. It was hunger. It was the frozen silence of Russia. Imagine leading the greatest army in Europe into a land so cold that steel becomes pain. A land where roads vanish, supplies disappear, and every step forward feels like stepping into death. That single campaign turned Napoleon's legend into a nightmare. Because the man who conquered capitals could not conquer the climate. The man who controlled Europe could not control snow. And that is the tragic beauty of his story. Napoleon reached the highest point a human can reach. He made Europe kneel. He made kings tremble. He made history revolve around his decisions. And then, suddenly, the fall began. The victories became harder. The enemies became smarter. The loyalty became thinner. And the empire that looked eternal began to crack. Until one day, the most powerful man alive became a prisoner on an island. Not in a palace, not on a throne, but surrounded by nothing except ocean and silence. So today we are not just telling the story of a conqueror. We are exploring the rise of a man who moved like lightning, ruled like a storm, and fell like a tragedy written by fate. Because Napoleon's story is not only about war, it is about ambition so massive it can reshape nations. And it is about the price of believing you are destined to be greater than the world itself. So stay with me, because by the end of this video, you will understand why Napoleon is still one of the most dangerous names ever spoken in history, and you will see that his greatest battle was not against Europe. It was against his own hunger for greatness. People love to say that Napoleon was lucky. They say he was protected by fate. They say fortune followed him like a shadow. But the truth is more disturbing than luck. Napoleon did not survive battlefields because the world spared him. He survived because his mind did not collapse the way other minds did. Because when cannon fire turned the air into thunder, most men became animals. They panicked. They froze. They ran. They shouted. They made mistakes that killed themselves and everyone around them. Napoleon did something else. He became quiet. He became focused. He became cold. Not cold like cruel, cold like steel, cold like calculation, cold like a man who can hear death screaming around him and still think clearly. That is not luck. That is a terrifying kind of self-control. Because imagine standing in the middle of a battlefield where cannonballs rip bodies apart like paper. Imagine the ground shaking. Imagine smoke so thick the sun looks like a dying eye. Imagine soldiers losing their minds, horses screaming, blood mixing with mud. Now imagine one man riding forward into that chaos as if he is walking through rain. No fear on his face, no hesitation in his voice, no trembling hands, just eyes scanning the field like a chessboard. Napoleon didn't just command battles. He read them. He listened to them. He could feel where the enemy was weak before anyone else could, and his soldiers noticed it. They watched cannon fire explode near him, and he would barely blink. They watched bullets cut the air, and he would continue talking, pointing, planning, as if death was an inconvenience. And that kind of calm does something powerful to an army. It spreads confidence. It turns fear into obedience. It makes men believe their leader is untouchable. Because in war, courage is contagious. And Napoleon's calm was the strongest form of courage. There are stories from his campaigns where explosions landed close enough to cover him in dirt and smoke, and he didn't even step back. He simply wiped his coat, he adjusted his position, he continued. And the men around him would stare with disbelief, as if they were watching something unnatural. Because it is unnatural. It is not normal to remain calm when the world is trying to kill you. That is why his enemies feared him. Not only because of his tactics, but because of his presence. Napoleon's presence on the battlefield felt like pressure. It felt like a storm that did not panic. It felt like an intelligence that could not be distracted. And that gave him an advantage that cannot be measured in numbers. Because most generals fight battles from a distance, from safety, from tents, from hills. Napoleon often positioned himself where he could see everything, where the action was loudest, where the risk was real, because he believed that a commander must feel the heartbeat of war. And while others feared the noise, Napoleon used the noise as information. The timing of cannon fire, the movement of smoke, the direction of retreating troops, the panic in the enemy's lines. To him, it was not chaos. It was data, and he processed it faster than anyone. That's why calling him lucky is too simple. Because luck does not plan, luck does not adapt. Luck does not create victory out of disaster. Napoleon did. He was frighteningly calm because his brain was built for crisis. When things went wrong, he did not collapse emotionally. He became sharper. When soldiers hesitated, he became decisive. When commanders argued, he became the final voice. And this calm was not just personal bravery. It was psychological warfare. Because the enemy could see him. They could see the small figure in the distance, surrounded by smoke, still moving forward, still directing, still controlling the battlefield. And it made them feel like they were fighting not just an army, but inevitability. But here is the darker part. A mind that calm in battle becomes dangerous in victory, because when you stop fearing death, you start believing you cannot be stopped. When you survive enough battles, you start thinking fate has chosen you. And that belief is addictive. Napoleon's calm made him great, but it also pushed him toward his biggest mistake. Because the same cold confidence that allowed him to stand near cannon fire also allowed him to underestimate the impossible. It allowed him to think nature would obey. It allowed him to think distance didn't matter. It allowed him to think Russia would be just another battlefield. So yes, Napoleon was not lucky. He was terrifyingly calm. And that calm turned him into a legend who could make armies believe in miracles, a legend who could walk through explosions without blinking, a legend who proved that the most dangerous weapon on the battlefield is not gunpowder. It is a mind that refuses to panic. Most people believe Napoleon's greatest enemy was Britain. They imagined ships, cannons, blockades, and an island that refused to kneel. And yes, Britain was powerful, but Britain was not the enemy Napoleon feared the most, because Napoleon understood something deeper than guns and armies. He understood that war is not only fought on battlefields. War is fought inside human minds. It is fought in the space between rumor and truth. It is fought in the headlines people read. It is fought in the stories people believe. And Napoleon became obsessed with controlling that battlefield. Because information can do what cannons cannot. Information can turn a victory into a legend. Information can turn a defeat into a misunderstanding. Information can create loyalty, fear, hope, and hatred without firing a single bullet. Napoleon didn't just want to win wars. He wanted to control the meaning of war. He wanted to control how people remembered him while the war was still happening. That is why his real enemy was not England. It was the chaos of uncontrolled information. It was the idea that a rumor could destroy him faster than an army. It was the idea that public opinion could poison his empire from the inside. Napoleon treated newspapers like weapons. He treated journalists like soldiers. He treated printing presses like artillery. He knew that if he controlled the narrative, he controlled the nation. So he built a system where stories were filtered, shaped, and released like military orders. He didn't just read newspapers. He guided them. He corrected them. He punished them. He used them. Because Napoleon had seen what happens when information escapes control. People panic. People rebel. People lose faith. And for a ruler, losing faith is the beginning of death. So he created propaganda with precision. He would send bulletins from the front lines that made his victories sound like miracles. He described battles like theater, like destiny, like divine proof of greatness. And when things went wrong, he didn't allow reality to arrive first. He was faster than reality. He made sure his version reached Paris before the truth could. Because the first story people hear becomes the story they believe. That is a rule Napoleon mastered. He could lose thousands of men and still appear strong. He could retreat and still look victorious. He could be wounded and still look untouchable, because his image was protected by paper and ink. And people underestimate how powerful that was in the early 1800s. There was no internet. There was no instant proof. There were only words, only rumors, only printed pages, only whispers traveling faster than armies. Napoleon knew that if he didn't shape those whispers, someone else would. And his enemies understood it too. They tried to poison Europe with stories about him. They called him a monster, a dictator, a destroyer of nations. They tried to make him look like the Antichrist of Europe. So Napoleon fought back, not with cannons first, but with control. He limited newspapers. He shut down critics. He demanded loyalty from editors. He turned journalism into an extension of the state. And when his soldiers marched, propaganda marched with them. Because Napoleon wanted more than victory, he wanted myth. He wanted people to see him as fate itself. That is why his portrait is everywhere. That is why his name became larger than France. That is why even his enemies could not ignore him. But here's the twist that makes this story even more fascinating. Napoleon didn't only use information to impress the public. He used information as a weapon against other rulers. He spread fear intentionally. He allowed Europe to imagine him larger than he was. Because if your enemy believes you are unstoppable, half the battle is already won. And Napoleon loved psychological dominance. He wanted opponents to make mistakes before the first shot. He wanted kings to hesitate. He wanted generals to panic. He wanted coalitions to collapse under the weight of his reputation. And reputation is information. It is the shadow of power. In many campaigns, Napoleon's greatest advantage wasn't his army. It was the enemy's fear of his army. But control has a price. The more Napoleon controlled information, the more he depended on it. He began to believe his own myth. He began to live inside the story he created. And that is when information became a double-edged sword. Because propaganda can inspire, but it can also blind. It can make you ignore warnings. It can make you underestimate reality. It can make you believe you are still invincible even when the empire is cracking. And slowly, Napoleon's system of control started failing. As wars grew bigger, as losses became harder to hide, as Europe united against him, the truth became too large to contain. Even the most powerful propaganda cannot hide hunger, death, and exhaustion forever. So what was Napoleon's greatest enemy? It wasn't Britain's navy alone. Napoleon feared many things, but not in the way people imagine. He did not fear cannons. He did not fear cavalry charges. He did not fear the sight of thousands of enemies marching toward him. Because Napoleon had learned how to control war. He could predict generals. He could read armies like patterns. He could break coalitions with speed and shock. But there was one enemy he could not intimidate. One enemy he could not negotiate with. One enemy he could not outsmart. Cold. Because cold is not a soldier you can defeat. Cold has no morale. Cold has no fear. Cold does not retreat. It does not care if you are a genius. It does not care if you are an emperor. It simply arrives and it destroys everything slowly, silently, mercilessly. Napoleon understood this, and that is why he feared it. Because he had seen what winter does to an army. He had seen men lose fingers, toes, and sanity. He had seen horses collapse into the snow like statues. He had seen cannons abandoned because metal becomes dead weight when the world freezes. And unlike an enemy army, winter doesn't stop attacking at night. It attacks while you sleep. It attacks while you march. It attacks while you stand still. Napoleon could fight men, but he could not fight temperature. And this fear became real, violently real, in the most disastrous campaign of his life, the invasion of Russia in 1812. At first, it looked like another conquest. Napoleon assembled the Grande Armée, the greatest army Europe had ever seen. Hundreds of thousands of men from across the empire. French soldiers, Poles, Germans, Italians, all marching under the belief that they were unstoppable, because Napoleon had never failed on that scale before. But Russia was not a normal battlefield. Russia was a trap made of distance and cold. The Russian armies refused to fight the perfect battle Napoleon wanted. They retreated, burning supplies, destroying food, dragging Napoleon deeper and deeper into emptiness. And Napoleon kept advancing, because he believed speed could replace preparation, because he believed victory was inevitable. And then slowly, the season changed. The air became sharper. Nights became cruel. Frost arrived like a warning. And still, the march continued, because Napoleon believed he could finish before winter fully arrived. But winter doesn't care about plans. Winter does not respect deadlines. It simply falls upon you like a sentence.